All right, so I'm doing the 10 things you should be doing in Synergy. Now, it's one of those fun little list things. Basically what inspired this list is it's just things that we've been getting into support throughout the year. That is kind of those, well, people should know this, and so I'm just trying to perpetuate the knowledge. Of course, with all the new stuff that's been presented here, I'm expecting this might be a little bit of a time capsule, just seem a little outdated by the time we all meet next time, because everyone will be in the cloud and all that. It'll be great. But for the time being, let's go through this list. Now, being a millennial, there's a problem with this list. It just doesn't really grab your attention, right? So what to do? I know what we should do. Perfect. All right. Now it's a real clickbait title, right, for everyone to enjoy. And of course, you can't have a clickbait title without the promise of a personality quiz right afterwards, right? Yeah, perfect. I really hope I get kindergarten cop. All right, so on to the list. So, tip number 1, back up your data. I know, no one thought of doing this one. It's so amazing, right? No one? Perfect. I know. You're welcome. All right, moving on to tip number 2, because we're good, right? All right, tip number 2, this will blow your mind. Back up your data. Perfect. All right, well, I guess we should probably slow this down a little bit, or else I'm going to blow through 20 of these, and we don't want that. So let's actually talk about what we're talking about when we say back up your data in Synergy. So in Synergy, as you know, we have ISAMC files. Now this isn't a surface-to-air missile developed by Apple. It is in fact an indexed file. Now on Windows and Unix, these index files are 2 different files. You have your ISM, which is your index file, and your IS1, which is your data. And as Steve has mentioned, and it's been mentioned a couple of times, these files can become out of sync. So we have an issue with synchronizing when we talk about backing up your data. One of the most common scenarios you can run into is if you're doing a copy, backing up your ISAM file, then if someone's making changes to that file while you're doing the backup, they can become out of sync. And so when you're going to back up your data, you want to use this nifty little tool that we have in Synergy called SynBackup. Once this is enabled, it has 4 different modes. It's got your not allowed, it's got your off mode, your pending, and your on mode. Now, only in on mode are you allowed to safely back up your data. And what it does is it suspends all cooperating processes. And now what that means is your ISUtil, your fconvert, and your Synergy runtime are going to be suspended. Well, suspension on on the user end isn't great, so we've come up with another problem. But luckily, we've got you covered on that one. So in code, if you want to get around just suspending and your user sitting there going, what happened? You can call synSetState, which instead of being suspended will make it so the program errors out, and then you can put error trapping around there and deal with it accordingly. Or you can, if you want a more hands-on approach, you have synGetState, which gets the state of what SynBackup is in at that time. And so let's say that you want to start you want to give people a warning that the backup's about to start. So what you would do is you put it into pending mode, and then you say check for pending mode. If in pending mode, put a little pop-up up there and say backup's about to begin. Please log off so we can do our backups. And so just some really great ways to go around suspending the process so it's more interactive for your user. So this next tip, mind-blowing, back up your data. So with this one, it's just very important that you're thinking about your backups. And I don't want a call into support early in the morning saying, hey, all my IS1 data files have been wiped out, and all I have is this ISM, and then I open it up and it's just a blank file. And I'm not saying this has happened to anyone, but the incident still haunts me to this day. So let's try to back up that data. And one thing we want to consider when we're talking about backing up your data is hardware. Now, the thing is, we're software. Software runs on hardware. We can't control your hardware. If your hardware decides to go crazy, we can't stop that from happening now, can we? But there are some things we can do to build for resiliency with your hardware. And the key to that is redundancy. We're talking dual power supplies, RAID 1 disks, data center monitoring software that kind of give you an idea if something's about to fail, right? And I know with Carl, he kind of mentioned a lot of this stuff. You know, he offloads to Amazon in the cloud, which is great. And like I said, this might be completely outdated because you'll all be in the cloud after this because you're so inspired. So in the installation configuration guide for Synergy, we have 4 different setups that we suggest. And like I said, the key to this is redundancy, redundancy, redundancy. So your level 1, or your level 0 in this case, because we're programmers, right, is you have your UPS connected to your server, and then it has the disk that's backing up the data to. What you want to do is you want to make sure that your settings in backup, of course, like we mentioned before you do your backups, and you want to make sure that you're killing processes. Specifically, we have a note here about Linux, Unix-based processes with that -15, and Roger mentioned that earlier as well. Then we move on to level 1, where you're adding in those dual power supplies, you're adding in your ECC memory and your RAID 1 disks, and then we move on to level 2, which is your cold standby, which means when your primary disk fails, you remove the disks and plug in the secondary server, and that equates to about 10 minutes of downtime while you're doing that. However, with the hot standby, you have your duplicate machine with a shared disk that's ready to go if the primary fails. The main server is attached to a SAN array with SSD drives that have dual paths to the server, along with dual controllers, battery backup, and RAID 1 disks. The way this works is if the hot standby is powered up and attached to the SAN array, so that if the main server crashes, the hot standby can take over with your application backup and be running within minutes. And so, as you see, there's just kind of this evolution. And really, you know, deciding on what is best for you just really depends on how accessible that data needs to be at all times. And so, stuff to consider, and there's more information in the installation configuration guide if you want more on that, or you can, you know, contact support. We'd love to talk to you about it. So. Tip number 3 is finally not back up your data. Tip number 3 is hook your data. So we've been talking a lot about IO hooks, and of course I just followed Steve, and IO hooks was talked about a lot with the SQL replicator, and there's actually a lot of utility with the IO hooks, and we're continuing to develop it with new features. IO hooks is great for your pre-operation and post-IO operations. You can use it with a lot of our other tools that I'll talk about when we're talking about data. It's really great for that. A couple of use cases, is you can use it to implement your business logic. You can move or process around data. You can create log files of what's going on with your data throughout the day. You can even use it to check, what files have been locked by what users. And then, of course, like I mentioned, other Synergy tools can be utilized with this, and we'll go a little more into those tools in a little bit. Since we're doing tips, and I don't want to just say use IO hooks because we've been saying that for a while now. One thing with IO hooks is you want to avoid performing network operations with your hook routines because this can be very costly. And Steve really demonstrates this well when he was talking with his SQL replicator, because he offloads it all and then does it in the batch while it's updating to the SQL. So that's the best way to be doing it, is kind of take a page from that book. So tip number 4 is to snapshot your data. We're talking about change tracking, which Roseanne mentioned as a newer feature in Synergy. In order to enable change tracking, you can either do it at file creation in your ISAMC, or you can use ctutil-a. Once you have enabled change tracking, it creates an internal structure within your ISAM file, which creates snapshot number 0. Once you have snapshot number 0, you can create and delete snapshots. And one thing to keep in mind is you only have a limit of 255 snapshots. And so when you're doing this, you want to make sure that you're implementing a way to not only create snapshots, but delete older snapshots that you no longer need. And so let's go a little more into how the snapshots work. And they work really well with the select statements. So select.change tracking can be used to check if change tracking is enabled on a file. It can be used to create snapshots with applied snapshot, which, while this is in use, it starts creating a snapshot that's unsaved until you hit that apply, and then it applies that new snapshot. You can also use refresh, so it refreshes the array of snapshots that it's holding, and then you can look at the snapshots individually. Now, if you're using ctutil and you already have a bunch of snapshots on your file, then you can just use the where class within the select statement, and you can look at changes within your files on your snapshots. And so this gives you a list of all the changes between 2 snapshots, or you can get net changes. So let's say from 1 snapshot snapshot to the next, you created a record and then you deleted the record, that's not going to show up in your net changes. And so, and then the really great feature is you can use the where to look at your snapshots and see what the records were like when that snapshot was taken. And so let's go into a little bit of a use cases, to kind of give you an idea of what to use this for. So you can use it to get changes over a period of time. One great use for this is, let's say that you have a service that's running 24/7 and you want to get results of end of day. You want to see what's been changed in your files, what transactions have been made throughout the entire day, right? And so what you do is you take a snapshot at the end of the day, you compare that snapshot to the last snapshot, and then you can make a little report or something and see what transactions have been created throughout the day without stopping at the entire operation. And so that's a great way to do it. Also, if you're doing a bulk operation on your ISAM files, and you want to have a restore point or a place to roll back, then you can use that as a snapshot of what the files were like before you did that. And so this is just a great way to keep a record of where the files were at before you made changes. Now, talking about bulk changes, this shocking number 5, hope everyone's ready for number 5, is, I'm just kidding, it's not back up your data. All right, tip number 5 is master your data. So tip number 5 goes into what the ISUtil utility. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have used this. You're probably currently using this. Hopefully you're using this for file maintenance. Once again, like I said, we get calls into support. People ask about ISUtil and they're like, well, what should I be using it for? I'm like, you should be using it for regular file maintenance. So, and of course, as if you were listening to Roger on the first day, there's going to be some changes to ISAM resiliency, and so once again, this might be a little dated come next time we meet, but it's a great thing to be doing now. So if you're not already doing this, so you can use ISUtil-V to verify your file, make sure that everything is synced and up to date. You can use the ISUtil-VI to get the information advisor, and it looks a little something like this. I just ran this on the syntax file that comes with your installs. Now, there's a couple of things to note on this. One of the things that you can see in here is there's no warnings, so the file is good because it would be giving you errors and warnings and suggestions if you had that. Here, you can see that you've got 50 blocks and 49 leaves, and what that's telling you there is the blocks are two different categories of blocks. You have your separator blocks and you got your key entry blocks. And so if you see that you have a lot of blocks, but that aren't accounted in that leaf count, then that means you've got, basically think of them as branches, lots and lots of branches, and as your file gets larger and larger, you'll see more and more in that, and the bigger it gets, the more important that your file maintenance will be. So let's kind of dive into each of these pieces here on your ISUtil-VI. So re-index and reorder your data. What we're talking about here is that optimization line right there. And so this gives you a percentage of how optimized your ISAM file is. And if it's getting kind of low, you can use ISUtil-R, which takes care of that index part of it. And then you can use ISUtil-RO to take care of that data portion. If you do have errors or anything like that when you're running ISUtil-VI, then you can use ISUtil-RA. But when you do that one, make sure you back up the file beforehand because it's going to make those changes, and it might cause some issues, maybe delete data. So make sure you do a backup before you do that, especially if you're doing this as an automated process. Keep that in mind. So, all right. Next, we're going to talk about another section, the compressing your data. That's that data compression part right there. You can use ISUtil-VC to see how well compression will work for you. Compression mostly works best if you have lots of alpha data in your files. We were talking a lot of string data, that kind of stuff. That compresses best. If you have a lot of numbers, it might not work so well for you, and VC is a good way to see if it's going to work for you. One thing I've been told, and we see a lot, is that a lot of people don't take advantage of compression in their customer files when they can, because what compression will do is we're talking smaller files, which means it's easier, faster to go through, and so lower disk space is always a great thing, and better performance is always good as well. Next, packing your data. In here, we're talking about the index densities, the leaf densities, separator blocks. So now we're talking about those individual blocks I was talking about there. And so what you can do is if you have a file that doesn't get a lot of frequent writes to, it doesn't get a lot of frequent changes, you mostly are doing reads to it, consider doing a frequent ISUL-RP on that and put it to about 90% density to really pack up those indexes and really help your performance. Especially as you can see with ISUL, we have a very high compression or density on these. And that's because the syntax file is mostly red. We don't we don't expect people to be making changes to it. And so that's why it's packed like that, and it's helping our performance. Now, if you have a key or a file that you think could be better compacted and you want to put higher density on it, then you can convert the file using ISUL-R-Q file equal density equal the density you're wanting. The issue here is you kind of have to know what you're doing before you do this, and I'll explain why. There are 3 different ways that density is done. If you just do the default behavior, you have what's called the natural fill. And so when the block is full, it will split the block. And so got a little animation here. We're splitting the block because it's full. What that does is that's one I/O operation, and then it will go and update those separator blocks. One thing to note with this is, like I said, these are branches, and think of the keys as the leaves here. And so if that separator block then gets full, then that can end up splitting all the way down. And so that's why paying attention to density is very important for your files. So after that's done, then the new entry is just added. It does a true random insertion, so it tries, it'll end up evening out eventually, and it ends up to about 75 to 80% density. Now, what happens when you specify density on a file? Well, if you're specifying density on a file, what it's going to do is what's called the balanced fill. So what it does is it tries to get as close to the density as you're asking for as possible. And so what it does is it tries to do a rotation. The first entry will go to the adjacent file, C, and in this example, we'll say that the new entry is about 5% addition to your density, and you've set it to 80%. So as you see, it's trying to flip that first entry in. It can't do that, and so it doesn't do that transaction, but then it tries to rotate the last entry into the next file, and it can do that. And so it'll complete the rotation, and then it'll add the new entry into the block. And as you can see, none of these are going to be completely 80%, and so it just gets as close as it can to 80%. And then that's another I/O routine that's going to change up that separator block. Now, the reason I say that you need to know what you're doing before you do this is because if you think about the scenario, is what if that 75% block there is actually really low on density? Well, then every single time you add to that almost full block right there in the middle, it just keeps doing the rotation. We're talking 3 I/O routines every single time it does the rotation, until eventually all those blocks will be full, and then it'll just end up doing a natural fill, the split block anyways. And so that's what you have to kind of watch out for. And plus, if you set the density to really low, then you're going to end up with lots and lots and lots of rotations every single time. So we're trying to avoid rotations when we talk about file density. So when do we want to specify our file density? Well, that's when you have a situation called the context fill. What this works best on is if you have in order sequential keys that are being added. And so we're talking, you got your 1, and then it goes 2, then 3, then 4, then 5. And so on an individual key that you know is going to be added in order and it's just sequential, then you want to specify a high density, like 90% on that. And that will increase your I/O, it'll lessen your I/O, because what's going to be happening is when a new entry comes in, it just goes ahead and creates that new block and then starts filling it in from there. And then makes the change to the separator block. So we're talking 2 I/O routines, much quicker. And it just fills it in. Now, the thing you can run into is if you're not doing in order, if you end up going in order and then you go out of order, then you can end up with some fairly empty blocks, and so you want to try to avoid that. Then again, if you have a key that's an auto key or something like that, then you can go ahead and set that density to like 100%, because you know that's going to be added in order sequentially because it's being done under the for you. And so that's a great way to control your file density and improve the performance on your data. One last thing I want to mention when we're talking about your data is to make sure that you're patching your data when new patches are coming out. A lot of these routines that I'm talking about today with your data, they all require revision 6, and so you have your revision 6 files, which we're also talking increases in performance and that kind of stuff, and so make sure your ISAM files are up to revision 6. There is the revision 4 compatibility version, but if you really want that performance, you really want to use those features, you want to get up to revision 6. One thing that I was told to mention is if you do a patch on your data, you could end up with these 4R6 or your 5R6 intermediate revision files. If you see this, this means that the file is very large and they didn't want to do all the conversion all at once. You can control that with that Q file equal convert option, and it'll just kind of convert as it's going. And so you might not be getting that the full benefit of revision 6 if you see that on your files. And so on larger files, if you have the time, go ahead and put in that convert option to get it all the way to revision 6. And so let's kind of do a change up from here. Our next 5 are going to be a little more on developer tools and that kind of stuff that I've run into. So let's move on to tip number 6. Oh no. You go to the Synergex website once and you end up with all these ads and okay, all right, let's just skip that. Sorry about that. All right, tip number 6, measure, compare, and test. So in this one, we're talking about the DBL profiler. Now, if you've used the DBL profile, you'll know what this does, but let's imagine for a second you're in a scenario where you have this colleague who's, unfortunately always wrong about everything because, we're right? And so they're saying, this, I have this process and it's doing what your code's doing, but it's doing it so much faster. Well, how? And you're like, well, that's probably not true, right? Yeah. And so instead of going back and forth and arguing about it, why don't we measure it and actually see which one's faster? And you can do that with the DBL profiler. Another situation you might run into is, let's say you've done an upgrade and for some reason your code has slowed everything down. Well, it's probably not your fault, so let's prove it's not your fault, right? Because why would it be our fault? So when you enable the DBL profiler with DBL-U or /profile if you're on VMS, it's got 3 granular settings, and so you just got to do some environment settings, DBL opt. You can do it for the full program, or you can do it with the program with subroutines, so that will give you all the specs for your subroutine. And then you can do it on individual lines. So what is measured when we're talking about this? Well, it outputs your CPU ticks. This is very important to note that this isn't real time that's being done. This is measuring ticks. If you do have a high performance machine, you can use profiler_processor_time to make adjustments to make it a little more sane on your measurements. Then it gives you your digital I/O, your page faults, your instances, which is how many times you've gone into that instance, like called that line or called that subroutine, and then you get your percent overall. So to give an example, this is a test I ran. This is from the log file, and I'll explain what this is in the next slide. But if you see, you've got your ITS, which is your instances, and I've called this subroutine 3 times, and it's giving me my individual ticks per instance. And so this way I can kind of compare individual subroutines and see which one's faster, even if they were called multiple times. And so what am I actually measuring here? Well, some of you might recall back in Synergy L a while ago, there was a debate whether +=1 was faster or if INCR, or the increment call, was faster. And there was a debate, well, let's use the profiler to figure it out. So what I did is I ran the profiler with these individual subroutines, and I ran it a whole lot of times. So I ran it 100 million times, 1 billion times, and 2 billion times. And as I got to that 2 billion, you can see a very clear pattern emerge. And it ends up that INCR is actually a lot faster than the +=1. And so you can use that profiler to, not say in your face because that's rude, but in your face, mine's is faster. So, and so let's also talk about debugging performance issues, because we've had an issue with this in the past. Someone did a major upgrade. They were going from Linux to Windows. They went from Synergy 9 to Synergy 10. They went from 32-bit compiler to the 64-bit compiler and runtime. and they were saying, hey, things are going slower. Well, that's a lot of variables to go over, and so what we want to do is isolate the variables. And so what you would do is you get all these different configurations, and you run the DBL profiler on the program that reproduces the issue. You know, one that you know is going faster in one environment, slower in the next, and then just piecemeal it out and do one variable at a time. And I suggest running the test 3 to 5 times. If you're seeing a lot of outliers, then you might want to run it even more to kind of get an average of what's actually happening in there. But this was a great way for us to actually see what the problem was, whether it was the change in the OS, or if it was the change in Synergy version, or if it was the change in the bit size, like what is actually causing it to happen. And so you can use the DBL profiler to actually get some measurements, some metrics, and actually like see what's going on there. So, moving on to tip number 7, create your own projects. One of the great things about Visual Studio is it's got a lot of features that you don't really think about, and there's just been one that we've been playing with a lot this year in support that's really been helping us out, and it's creating project templates in Visual Studio. So, let's say that you have a project, you've got settings in that project. Every time your company runs up a DBR project, it needs certain settings and certain ways that it has to be configured, and it has certain include statements or whatever. Well, instead of redoing code, because we hate rewriting code and redoing configurations, you can use the project template wizard to offload that project, and then you get your project template, and then you can give that and share it amongst other people in your company, and it really saves on using up all that time. You can even take that a step further and use the V6 project, which is a project type in Visual Studio, which creates a Visual Studio extension. And what you can do is you can take all your project templates, feed it into that V6 project, and it will create a extension that will add all of those project templates into Visual Studio, and so everyone in your company can have it. And we've been using this at support as a project. We've been we make a lot of test cases. If everyone's ever called into support, you've probably heard us say, can you create a test case for that? Or it looks like I'll have to create a test case. And so what we did is we just took different technologies, we made a base use of that, like say the HTTPS API and stuff like that, and we put that into a project, and then we made all those projects into a template into the V6 project, and then installed that onto all of our machines, so then we can all have a little base place to jump off if we need to test a technology or create a test case. So it's been very helpful, and if you are in Visual Studio, it's a great thing you can take advantage of right now. Tip number 8 is, this has been mentioned multiple times already, but your Q runtime compat. This is an option that you can do from the command line. You can do it in Visual Studio that makes it so the compiler will treat the compile and give you warnings and errors as if you were compiling in an older version. One thing to note, though, is it does not actually use the older compiler to compile your code. It's just it just tells you if you're using features that will not be recognized by that older runtime. And we already got a question when Roseanne was up here on what were the lowest compatibility versions. So 9.5.1 is the lowest runtime for traditional Synergy, and then 10.1.1 is the minimum in Synergy.net. And to kind of continue on with that, Marty kind of showed a little bit of where that is on the configuration on your build tab in Visual Studio. But as an example, I ran this Q runtime compat with the lowest version 9.5.1 on a program that was using the join select, and the join select is a newer feature, and so it told me, I cannot resolve this type for this field, and so it was able to point out to me that, you can't, your code's not going to be compatible with that lower runtime because you're using a feature that was not featured on there. And as another note, when we're talking about compatibility, another one that doesn't get used a whole lot is the DBL/platform, which can give you compile options as if you're in 64-bit or 32-bit. So also a very good thing to be using. And the whole idea behind this is, we've been encouraging people, to upgrade. Well, you don't have to let go of, what my customer isn't upgraded. Well, you can still have your development environment in the latest things, and configure it this way. So, really great tip. Number 9 is the utilize logs. We have our DBG select, which was mentioned by Roseanne. This is your debug select log, which if you're using your select statements, I highly, highly, highly encourage you to be using this, and I'll kind of go into why. And then Visual Studio, you've got your background log and your activity logs if you're seeing those created. And then I want to kind of go over the XF Server Plus log because that one's been coming up a lot this year as well. So your select debug log, when you do set this in your environment, you can put it to option 1 or option 2. Option 2 is a little bit overkill. You'll get some stuff in there about optimization that you don't really need. So I'm just sticking with the option 1 stuff here. And then of course you set your file and all that. As you can see from the very tiny screenshot right there, what it does is it gives you your files and then it tells you what table it's been assigned to, and then it gives you your calls that you were using those files for. Then later on, and this one is new to 10.3.3f, we added this in and it tells you why we picked the optimization that we did. There's a little note in there, you can see the language reference manual, and it explains this table a little bit more, but basically what it comes down to is we're picking contiguous keys, and our priority is on non-duplicated keys that are ordered and in that order. So non-duplicate first, then ordered. So your best keys are going to be your contiguous keys that are non-duplicated and ordered, then non-duplicated, not ordered, and then duplicated but ordered, and then not ordered and duplicated, and then just free for all at that point. So this is a very helpful feature for optimization to make sure that your files have the keys that you're actually selecting on. And then the last part, I call this your grade at the end, your little report card. How well did you do? You want to make sure that these numbers are as low as possible when selecting from your tables, because this will tell you how well your select did. Because if these numbers are saying that you ended up not optimizing anything and you end up grabbing the entire file, well then you're not doing the select right, because you might as well have just read in the entire file at that point. So this is what I call your report card for select statements. Visual Studio log files, you've got your background log. I find this one very helpful that a lot of people don't know about, because if you're seeing some weird behavior or whatnot in Visual Studio, especially with your IntelliSense, it might be that something's just not hooked up right. And so an early indicator is you can check your background log, which is if you drill down into your project directory, into the object file, into wherever your build's going into, you'll see the name of your project / your background log. And it'll give you build errors, because that's how the IntelliSense works. It has that compiler working around in the background to populate that information for you. And so that's a great indicator that something's just not hooked up right, especially if you're trying in new things or just moving over code. So I found that very helpful, and a thing we frequently turn to in support. The activity log, which a lot of people have asked about in the past as well. Usually you'll get a warning or an error if something happens in Visual Studio. It'll say, go check the activity log. Well, a lot of this will give you information about stuff you can look at and fix. And of course, we might ask for this log if you send in a support case as well. So it's a great thing to check for if you're seeing errors with the product. Then the XF Server Plus log. The server-side logging I wanted to mention because a lot of people don't understand is there's also timestamps in there, and we've been talking about metrics just earlier. And so what you can do is, instead of making your XF Server Plus call and just watching it fly away into wherever, you can actually look at this log and see how long it took. You can see if there's any issues getting back, because it'll log your errors, your warnings, that kind of stuff. Any connectivity issues you were having, that's all going to be in that log. And so it's a very helpful log. And one of the very things that I'm kind of jealous if you're in the VMS environment about is the ServStat log. If you're using XF Server Plus with ServStat, it really gives you the guts of what's going on with RSynD and all those processes, because of the way that VMS works with RSynD that's a little different on VMS. This is a great way to see your statuses, your process runnings, and that kind of stuff, and really tweak and see what's really happening on your machine. So. All right, moving on to the last one. When all else fails, then please let us know. A great resource that you have with Synergex is that you can contact us and we can help you. With support, just think of us as another extension of your team. We really want to hear from you. We want you to contact us and help us, help you through this, because we're succeeding when you're succeeding, so that's great. And you'll all have those PSG hours and that kind of stuff that comes with the dev partners, so that's a great resource there. One thing that we develop at Synergy that's not development tools that we've really been making a push for is our education, and so you can check out our learning section in Synergex and the videos that we've been producing. We try to get the word out. We're trying to help you with more than just your development tools, and so that's a good one to go check out as well. There's been a lot of great videos on there. And then also there's the GitHub and Code Exchange, which we've mentioned some cool stuff in there as well. And then, if that's failing and you're finding that the tools aren't working for you, then get involved. Get onto that community website, post on ideas. The people we hear from the most are the people who are having the most success. So we want to hear from you so we can help you be successful by you giving us what you need so that we can help you get to where you need to go. And Answer's a great thing for, let's be a community, let's be involved. And once again, if that all fails, contact support. We'll listen to your troubles, even if it's just a shoulder to cry on, though emotional support may be billed separately, so just as a note. All right, so we'll go ahead and do questions. As a note there is a link to a BuzzFeed quiz, the things I do for you guys. That will go to the Arnold quiz that I promised you, and so there you go.
Well, the top question, Phil, is which Arnold are you?
I took the quiz and I ended up with Jingle All the Way.
All the Way, not Kindergarten Cop?
Not Kindergarten Cop. I was so very disappointed.
How would you use Send Backup in a high availability environment where data is being backed up and replicated continuously during the day using VM snapshots and or replication?
So this is a good question, and maybe Roger can help me out with it a little bit as well.
Well, there's a new backup snapshot service that we talked about in the presentation on the first day that would work with the snapshot providers to freeze the I/O and the SYN backup from time to time as when the snapshots were taken. If you're taking snapshots every second, there's no easy way of keeping your files in sync. There's no magic bullet to this, but the backup service could do that. And if you're interested in today, talk to support and we can get you an early version of the backup service that works with the snapshot providers to do just that.
Awesome.
Thank you, Roger. How do we know what version of the ISAM file that we have?
So there's a great utility called IPAR. It's built in with all those, with ISUtl and all that. It's all part of your install. IPAR will give you what revision you're on, and so especially on your larger files, you want to be using IPAR to check what your revision is, see if it's maybe stuck in that conversion file. That's a very good question. So IPAR, use it.
IPAR. This next one is more of a comment, but DBL Profiler would be great for unit testing performance.
It would be. It really would be. As a note, Visual Studio also has a profiler that you can use that's built into Visual Studio. Unless you want to comment any more on that, it's great. So you can use that as well. I prefer just that kind of down and dirty command line. Here's my DBL profiler, and just see what's going on. But if you have something running, then you can definitely use the profiler in Visual Studio too.
And the last one, when creating a project template, are you able to include other projects and add them as references to the solution?
You are. It's a little more of an involved process, and it's in that link I included in the slide. And so I'll try to make sure those links are available to you. One thing to note that I forgot to mention, which thanks for bringing that up, the common props file that we've been talking a whole lot about. If you're going to make a project template, the common props actually counts as a separate project file, so you do have to do the multi-project on that, or else you're going to run into problems. You're going to have a bad time. And so you can, if you're going to do the project template, don't include your common props file, and then you can just use the option to grab another common props file when you do create that, or you can use the multi-project. And so, yes, there is a way to do that.
Excellent. Thank you, Phil.